Welcome to the Show Me Podcast with your host, Geoff Livingston. Every episode, a guest joins Geoff and discusses how images tell stories and what makes them work or not.
Excellent. All right, folks, welcome to the Show Me Podcast, and we are on episodes number 11 and 12 of the season, and it's going to be a little bit of a special episode. Normally, we talk about an epic photograph or a photographer and go through them, and we certainly have a lot of epic photographs to talk about, but it's a very serious show, and it's because we're going to be talking about 9/11 today and the various incidents that occurred and kind of re-experiencing it through the eyes of Lieutenant Colonel Bob Darling from the U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Hey, Bob, how are you?
Geoff, great to be with you today. Thank you very much.
Really, really appreciate you coming in. And Bob wrote a book called 24 Hours Inside the President's Bunker, and I've had the privilege of photographing him a couple of times. I got to know him, and I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to break the rules and get this guy in here because this is going to be a pretty awesome show, and I think it'll be something people would appreciate. So thanks for making the time.
Well, I'm glad you did. Thank you.
Cool. So for people's sake, let's just talk a little bit of a setting. I mean, first of all, 9/11 was obviously a huge day in your personal life. It was a huge day in many people's lives, but more so for you, why?
You know, I was on active duty at the time with the United States Marine Corps. I was a helicopter pilot, and I was assigned to the White House Military Office. We call it WHAMO, White House Military Office.
Right.
I was working in the Airlift Operations Department. Essentially, what we do is move presidential gear in advance of the president's movements worldwide.
Right.
I was there on 9/11, and all of a sudden, for the second time in our history, first time being 1814, when Dolly Madison was running out the back door,
right,
when the British were
burned the White House, right?
Burning down the White House.
Right.
And now here we are, 2001. They evacuated the White House at 9:45 a.m. that morning after the Pentagon was struck. And I responded to the underground presidential bunker complex known as the President's Emergency Operations Center.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And we should probably say, hey, Panama, how are you? She's our sound engineer, Panama. If you could roll through the photos as we go through them and the White House stuff. And if you could kick in too, if you want to, that'd be great. And any personal memories as well. So you were in the White House bunker, and now were you there when the first planes were hitting? How did that happen logistically? You said 9:45, you went down before or after? What was going on?
Yeah, just like the rest of America, we were watching TV. Somebody came into our office. My office was in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. We were doing airlift operations, our daily job. The president was in Sarasota, Florida. He was at the Emma E. Booker Elementary School. And at 8:46, when the North Tower was struck, someone came running into the office, said, turn on CNN, apparently a small airplane.
Right, they thought it was a plane, right? Like a biplane or something.
Exactly, a small Cessna type airplane. Must have hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center complex. So like everybody else, we were watching TV. We saw the first plane at 9:03. We saw United Airlines Flight 175 careen into the South Tower.
Right.
And then at 9:37, the Pentagon was struck by American Airlines Flight 77.
Right.
It was at that point that we are on high alert. We had two towers burning. The Pentagon was burning. And then there was a threat that came out that there was an aircraft heading for the White House. And soon after, they evacuated the White House at 9:45.
That's insane. Now, I remember what happened to me when that was going on. I was in Tyson's Corner at monster.com, Monster Worldwide. And I was making cold calls, and I saw the first plane kind of flash on the CNN on my computer. But then the next thing that happened was I was cold calling this guy. I'm like cold calling, like, hey man, can you give me some business? And he says, where are you located? I see you have a 703 area code. I'm like, yeah, I'm in Washington, D.C. He goes, you might want to put the phone down and turn it and go outside and see what's happening. And I did. And I walked down, like literally the entire office, everybody was running around screaming and watching the TV. It was really insane. And that was just when the Pentagon was about to get hit. We could see the Pentagon burning from our office window. We could see the little cloud come up. It was horrible. But first I want to show you some stuff, show you some photos, because I want to get your reaction, your thoughts, and kind of like what you were thinking of these photos when you saw them. And this first one is by Robert Clark. He actually won the World Press Photo Award that year for these 4 photos where you can see the second plane coming in, 1, 2, boom, and then the massive explosion.
Yeah, the whole world saw that photo, saw that recreation of those photos happen. It must have been 1 billion people watching TV at that point because everyone was tuned in to the plane hitting the North Tower. So people were trickling in now to turn on the TV, to get to a radio, to call a loved one, to see what was going on. But by the time United Airlines Flight 175 came into view with that photo, the whole world was watching.
Did you guys know at that point it was a terror attack, or was it suspicion, or was it just like you were scrambling like everybody else trying to figure it out?
Well, just like everybody else, we knew at that point there's no way 2 towers, 2 110-story towers in New York City could both be hit, on the same morning like that. It was a full-fledged terrorist attack unfolding right before America's eyes, right at that moment. We all knew that.
Right, and one of the other things that people don't talk about is, we don't think about this, is how big those towers were. Like one of the photos I was looking through when I was researching our show, and I found was this kind of a famous photo from, I think a Reuters photographer took it, but with the Brooklyn Bridge right there, and there's the explosion on the tower, but the scale of the explosion next to the bridge, it just shows you how massive this was, and it must have just been horrifying.
You're talking about a 757 size aircraft that just took off out of Newark Airport on its way, out west somewhere.
Right. Loaded with fuel, right?
Yeah, I guess these aircraft came out of Boston Logan Airport, but they're all going to the West Coast.
Right.
Flight 93 was out of Newark. But hitting the towers in a 757 full of fuel, you can only imagine you had a small nuclear detonation at that point.
Wow. So what was going on once you guys were trying to tell the president what was going on? What were you trying to do to kind of get things under control?
Sure. We were in like I said, the Eisenhower building at the time. We weren't worried about the president. There's plenty of people around the president worried about the president.
Right.
What we were worried logistically is how are we going to support the president? Wherever the president goes, in advance of him is Secret Service, snipers, doctors, helicopters, limousines, phones, medical teams. Everything has got to be in advance of him. So wherever he decided to go that day, especially with the Pentagon burning, he wasn't going to come back to Washington, D.C. So wherever they were going to take him, we had to know as quickly as we can so we could get those assets airborne to be there waiting for him when he got there. So we were worried about the president's logistics.
Right. So that was your normal job anyway,
Yes.
right? And how was it reciprocated when it was told to him? I know the Andrew Card photo is pretty famous. I know you talk about it in your book a little bit, in your speech. And, tell us about that moment when you guys knew that he knew and things were on, so to speak.
Sure. It was the second tower was struck, and Andy Card, the White House chief of staff at the time, just got word. He's traveling. He's behind the wall in a traveling White House situation room where all the secure phones and Secret Service and everybody reside. And he said, it's time to let the president know America's under attack. And literally he walked into that classroom and whispered in the president's ear, Mr. President, a second airliner has just struck the South Tower. America is under attack.
That's crazy, right?
Try to imagine that. You're the president
and you got
of
little
the
kids, right?
You're in front of an elementary school classroom. There's the White House press corps against the back wall that's looking right at you. You can see the horror on their faces. Their Blackberries at the time were all going off.
Oh, no.
And you have to make a decision. Do I get up and leave, or do I stay here and remain calm and let my staff start building my situational awareness? That's a tough call for anybody, let alone the president of the United States.
Right. And it was really interesting, too, because he was clearly, like all of us, deeply affected by it. I remember seeing several moments where he'd be under a camera and you could see the tears come into his eyes. He cared greatly about the country, cared greatly about what was happening, and it obviously affected him in a deep way.
Yeah. I just want you to know, President George W. Bush was the truest American patriot I've ever met, in the sense of the word.
Right.
Everybody loves America, but you say it happened on his watch. He felt it. He knew he was commander in chief, and he knew it was now incumbent on him to do something about it, to defend liberty, to protect America, to take military action.
Wow. That's interesting. How often did you talk to him, by the way, just generally speaking?
On the trips, he and I would pass each other because we were all in the same geographical location. He knew who we were. We were all military members. He was quick. He gave us unbelievable access. We had, we were the closest to the president most of the time.
Right.
And he was very personable. I saw him at Camp David a few times. I saw him in China, when I was out there. So whenever I had an opportunity to say hello to him, I took it.
That's cool. And then, so based on that and kind of like just being around this person a lot, what do you think of his mood over the month or so afterwards? I mean, tell me about how his body language was. Like, how was this guy? I mean, was he really, was the image that we saw in the media reflective of what was really happening?
I want to say yes to that, Jeff, but I want to tell you that when the day started out, it looked like President Bush, like the rest of us, was trying to get his sea legs, if you will.
Right.
What is happening? What does this mean for America? What is my new role? And as the day went on, you almost saw the president himself transform, and from being just the president of the United States to being the true president / commander in chief of the U.S. military worldwide,
right.
Where his role now was to lead America, defend America, fight terrorism with America in defense of our freedoms. And you saw that transformation almost take place in his body language. He went from being shocked and horrified like the rest of us to being resolute,
assertive, right,
and in charge by the end of the day. When he came back to the bunker complex that night and got his second presidential daily brief, it was true. America was going to war. The rest of his cabinet had better catch up.
Right. Now, one of the more incredible things that happened, at least for those of us that live in this city, was that the Pentagon was attacked. I mean, here is the world's greatest fort, right? Probably the largest office building in the area, just massive stone structure, and it got struck. America's head of military got struck. And it was horrifying. And tell us what you think when you see, like, here it is being hosed down after the fire is pretty much done. But geez, I mean, like, what was your thinking? I mean, you're in the military at that time. I mean, you have to be just like shocked, right?
Sure, and it was much more than just the Pentagon being the epicenter of America's military might. If you think about it, they went after the two towers, which is America's financial might.
Right.
Flight 93 was heading for the dome on the U.S. Capitol, which is America's capital might, if you will, where
right.
Congress, spends $3 billion a year. And then they were going for the Pentagon, which is a symbol of our military might.
Right.
So they were going for, this was not just arbitrary targets where they all just said, let's go hit something with, as soon as you get an airplane hijacked, let's go hit something.
Right.
This was a planned attack against America on all three facets of our strength. And this one just happened to be on our military might.
Wow. So what was the reaction at that time? This is when you were all, boom, let's go to the bunker, right?
The reaction was operationally mindset now. It's over. We're going to the bunker. We got things to do. Everybody do your job. There's no
time for emotion.
Yeah, no time for emotion. No extra, extraneous type activity. Do what you're trained to do, and let's get it done in support of the President of the United States. The military that, our country was attacked. The military's forefront right now. We're going to defend America. Let's get to work.
Wow, man, it's crazy. And for those of you that are watching, I'm just pulling up photos and going through the run of the show so we have stuff to show you while we're talking about it. Now, so you're down at the bunker now. What's going on with Rumsfeld? I mean, that's another story in its own right, correct?
Sure is. We just got word that we had another aircraft, United Flight 93 now, was spotted somewhere south of Pittsburgh, inbound Washington, D.C. So we have two towers burning. The Pentagon was struck by American Airlines Flight 77. Now we have another aircraft hijacked inbound. So we go to what we call the National Command Authority. The National Command Authority made up of the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. Those are the two people who can put our military forces into an offensive posture and take lethal action against our foes. It has to come from those two people.
Right.
So naturally, when Vice President Cheney was in the bunker, the president he knew was trying to get airborne in Florida, so he was reaching out for Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the other member of our National Command Authority.
Right.
And for whatever reason, Donald Rumsfeld wasn't there. Though he was in the building that morning, he was in his office. They entered his office after the first tower was hit. He was sticking with his schedule. At 9:03, when the second tower was struck, they re-entered his office, said, "Mr. Secretary, we need you down in the Operations Center," called the National Military Command Center. He said, "I'm sticking with my schedule." Finally, at 9:37, when the Pentagon was struck, he literally felt his office shake. And he got up out of his chair and he ran outside to assess the damage, assist with the wounded. And just like everybody else, he was trying to save lives.
Right.
And
he was just reacting, right?
he was reacting. A very admirable thing to do. But now we have the president trying to get airborne. We got the Secretary of Defense in the parking lot, lost at the Pentagon. We have nobody at the helm of our National Command Authority giving offensive lethal instructions to the U.S. military.
And this is when Cheney kind of took control?
That's when he took control. He literally stood back in and ordered our military forces into action. He almost assumed, he's vice president, but he almost assumed the role of Secretary of Defense, which he had under President H.W. Bush.
Right.
So he went right back to being almost Secretary of Defense in that mode.
He also served in the Ford administration too, right?
He was chief of staff for President Ford.
Right. So he's like, he knows what to do.
One of the things I learned after all this was over was experience matters in a crisis, and having really Vice President Cheney, somebody with that level of experience in our U.S. government on 9/11, did nothing but benefit us greatly.
And he's kind of like the way he's portrayed by Hollywood and other folks, and I don't want to get into that whole nightmare, but I mean, he's kind of portrayed negatively, historically speaking, but he's kind of like the anti-hero of the story. I mean, he's a guy that really kind of stood up and in many ways saved a lot of lives that day.
And I want to just be really clear about this.
Yeah.
Those of us who were with him and stood next to him and watched him take action, he is not anything other than our hero that day.
Right.
He was the one who got America moving forward. He was the one who had the courage to defend America by ordering the shoot down of Flight 93. He was making the hard calls.
Right.
While we were waiting the president to get airborne to assume that role. Without Vice President Cheney, we would have had no decisions made until well after 10:15 that day.
Right. And when did the president finally get airborne?
It was soon after. It was about 9:35 when he was, that morning he was, I want to make sure I get my time right. When he finally checked in, they had an air threat conference, which is when the president calls all his cabinet members to come up on the net, on the satellite frequencies, if you will.
Yeah.
And now I guess that was 10:15 that morning.
Wow.
10:15.
So by then the first tower dropped.
So you're 8:46 and 9:03 and then 9:37, and we didn't hear from the commander in chief until 10:15.
Oh my God. All right. So while all this is going on, here's a photo of the towers burning together. So this is still going on, right?
Yes.
So are you guys getting like live updates from New York? I mean, this is what America's watching, this horror, right? We're wondering when the next plane is going to hit.
Yeah. What was going on then is our first responders in New York City were doing their job. We were getting reports that they were clearing people out of those two towers, and they were pushing people to the north and to east and west away from the burning towers, saving lives, closing all bridges and tunnels to and from Manhattan, making them all one-way streets, if you will, off Manhattan Island. So they were doing their job. Our job at the time was to get the president airborne and get logistic support for the president. And the Pentagon's job now was to raise the alert level for our military forces to know. We didn't know for sure whether the attack was over, were there other hijacked planes in the air. And so there was a whole nother parallel effort going on to make sure America is defended.
Wow, that's insane. And how do you feel when you see this thing? Like, what does that take you back to during that time? Was it just, you guys were just still locked down, right? Just couldn't even process it.
It's an emotional time for me. It's 18 years ago, almost to the day, right? It's still very emotional. One of the things that military members like myself have to remember, and we do remember, is this happened on our watch. We were the ones in an all-volunteer force that raised our right hand to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, and we were attacked here in the homeland on our watch. And those of us in uniform remember that very, very clearly and take it very personally.
But it was still kind of unfathomable, right?
It is our job to be prepared for the unfathomable, right? That's what we do exercises for. That's why we train so hard. That's why we take all these tax dollars that we have to have the best equipment and the best trained forces worldwide. Yes, I appreciate you saying it was kind of unfathomable, but nonetheless, it was on our watch.
Well, I'm going to let you off the hook, man. But let's talk a little bit about Flight 93, and then we'll break and we'll start the second half of the
Sure.
episode.
Sure.
So now you know Flight 93 has been hijacked. How did you find out, first of all?
Well, it came in from we were all in the bunker complex. I had just gotten down there about 9:45 that morning. At 9:52, my phone was ringing out loud. I picked it up, and it was the upstairs situation room now calling down into the bunker complex, saying that they were tracking another hijacked aircraft 16 miles south of Pittsburgh. We didn't know it was Flight 93 at the time. We knew we had an unidentified hijacked aircraft. Wasn't responding. It was way too low, off course, racing towards Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Vice President Cheney now talking to the FAA, talking to the air traffic controllers, ascertained rapidly that aircraft is way off course. It's screaming towards Washington. That's a hijacked aircraft. That's when we were looking for Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and that's when Vice President Cheney ordered lethal action against United Flight 93.
Tell us about that moment. Like, first of all, was Condi Rice in there yet or no?
Condoleezza Rice, who was our national security advisor at the time, was there because literally as soon as we got the phone call, I turned around to pass it to the military aide, and then all of a sudden I realized Vice President Cheney is here. Behind him was his wife, Lynn. Here comes Dr. Rice. Behind her was her deputy, Stephen Hadley, and then Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, because everyone who was in the West Wing was now forced into the bunker complex as a result of the Pentagon being struck and the White House being evacuated.
Right. Yeah. And I remember at this time too, we were starting to freak out and we were getting evacuated out of Tyson's Corner. It was a nightmare, but nothing compared to what you went through. So now you have everybody in the bunker. What does Cheney say? Like, what is his logic as he goes through like, hey man, we have to take this thing down?
He doesn't discuss his logic openly with us. He's taking it in. He's doing this real assess, decide, act almost, instantaneously. It's coming to him. He hears about this hijacked plane. Now he's reaching out for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who's not there. So now he's got to make a decision. Do we just let it keep screaming at us? And putting himself back into the Secretary of Defense role, he immediately told the National Military Command Center, get me 2 F-15s out of Otis Air National Guard Base. Let me know when they're airborne. Stand by to shoot this aircraft down.
Holy shit. Excuse my language. Okay, we're gonna pause here and get into our second half of the show. For those of you that are listening, we appreciate any donations and sponsorship because it costs money to produce these episodes. And thank you so much again for being a part of this show, Bob. But I'm thinking Lieutenant Colonel Darling after this conversation.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's awesome, and we're gonna wrap up our 911 story when we come back. All right, Panama.